Hello everyone, this is Sangwi and welcome back to the 8th Python lesson. Today we're going to be going over classes and methods. So first off, in order to understand this, we have to look at Python as the language. Python is object-oriented programming. It's an object-oriented programming language, also known as OOP, which means instead of focusing on using functions, it focuses on using objects. So what are objects? Well, objects are things, basically the equivalent of nouns in Python. They're a collection of variables and functions. They're a collection of data, which are the variables, and methods, which are the functions, that then act on those data or variables. It's a way of organizing code, and objects are a member of a class, and you can create any number of objects with any number of classes. So what are classes then? Classes are what objects are defined by and a way to classify those objects into groups. You can organize code using classes. So to get a slightly better idea of what objects and classes are, we can think of classes as blueprints for that object. For example, it has all the details. For example, if the class is the house, it has all the details such as the floors, the doors, and the windows, etc. And based on these descriptions and these guidelines, we build the house. These houses are then the objects. Many houses can be made from objects. For example, these would all be objects of that house class. An object is also called an instance of a class, and the process of creating this object is called instantiation. So all of these are classes, and out of these we can create objects however many we want and what we want to. So to create a class, we simply write class and then the name of the class. And then for now, we'll put pass. Pass lets Python know that we're not going to put anything in it for now, and we're just going to leave it be, and we can put stuff in the class later on. Now let's look at inheritance. So in inheritance, there are children and parents. So let's say there's class A and class B. If class A is part of class B, then class A is a child of class B, and class B is class A's parent. So let's take a look at what this looks like in the graph that we showed before. So let's say we have the class things. So as children classes, we would have animate and inanimate things. And then, so therefore, these two classes would be child classes of things, and things would be the parent class of these two. Then if we go a little further, we can have animals and clothes. So again, these would be the child classes. This would be the child class of inanimate, and animals would be the child class of animate. Then if we go even further, we can add in reptiles as animals as child class, and then animals would be reptiles parent class, and so on and so forth. Now to create child and parent classes, what we want to do is create another class. So in this case, it would be animate, and inside the parentheses, it would have the name of the parent class. We'll also put pass for this for now. And we can do this for as many classes as we need. Again, if we want the class animate to be a parent class, then we have animals, and this would be the child class of animate. And we can continue doing these for mammals, lizards, and everything we need. Now let's take a look at self. So self is a parameter used in Python to represent different instances or objects of a class. Since the class is just a blueprint, self allows access to the methods and to the attributes of each object. This lets each object have its own attributes and methods. So even before creating these objects, we want to reference the objects as self while defining the class. We'll use these in a couple of examples later on in the video. For example, let's say that there's a variable a that's created in the class, but let's also say that there's a variable a that's used as the parameter of a method that's in the class. By calling self, we're using the value of the variable in the class itself instead of the method, which is something that we want to do in certain cases. For functions that we define in a class or methods, we need to put self as the first parameter. Now let's talk a little more about objects. So we need to learn how to initialize objects. Initializing is getting values or properties ready to be used. To do this, we use the init function, which is a way to set properties for an object when the object is first created. Python will also automatically call this init function when a new object is created to initialize it. Now we've talked about creating classes, so now let's see how to create objects. So let's say we have a class giraffes. and then we'll pass for now. But to create an object, we can just create a new object by doing this. So to use the init function, let's create a class called giraffes. Then let's create a function using the init function. So to use this, there's 2 underscores, 2 on each side, which is a total of 4 underscores. And then as the first parameter, we need to put self because it's a method. And then as the second one, let's put spots. So then let's create a variable that uses self.giraffe spots, which is equal to spots. So what this is doing is taking the value of the parameter spots and saving it for later by using the variable giraffe underscore spots. So by doing this, we can call on this variable later on in our code. To see this in action, we can create a couple of new giraffes. So let's create a giraffe named Sam, and this would be a new giraffe. And for the spots, let's say Sam has 70 spots. We can also create another giraffe called Bob and give Bob 200 spots. So then when we do print, we can run, and then we get 70 spots and then 200 spots, which is what we want. Now let's talk a little bit more about functions. But first, we need to look at the difference between methods and functions. So methods are associated with objects and you can't call them by name. By this I mean that you have to put it in the format object.method, close and start and close parentheses in order to call a method. And this is because it belongs to a class and it belongs to an object, so you can't call it independently. It is dependent on an object and a class. You also need to use self with methods, which is something that we'll show a bit later on. Now moving on to functions. Functions are not associated with objects and you can call them by name. So by this I mean that you can just say the name of the function and start and end parentheses without having to put object dot or things like that. So it is not dependent on class and it's independent. You also don't need to use self, but there are a couple of similarities between these two. They both perform actions, they both do things, and they both may or may not return something. To create a function, we simply just create a function. So we can make this print out I am a function. But to create a method, which is in a class, we first need to create a class. So then we'll create a function inside of this class, which becomes a method. And remember, because it's inside the class, we have to put in the parameter self. So to test this, we can call the function, and then we can also call the method inside of class. So to do that, we call it like this, and we have to satisfy the self parameter, so we put in class, and if we run this, then we will get I am a function and I am a method. Now let's talk a little bit about characteristics. So these characteristics of objects or functions describe what an object is and what an object can do, or actions, which are the functions of that object. It's a trait that all members of the class and its children share. So if we look at this with our graph, if we have animals as the class, then the characteristics of it would be breathe, move, and eat food, and these would also be the functions of this class. Now if we move down to mammals, which is one of the child classes of animals, then this functions is feed young with milk, since mammals feed their young with milk. So this would be one of the functions of mammals, but it would also have all of the functions that animals have, such as breathe, move, and eat food because of inheritance. Now if we move down one step further, we then have elk, which is a mammal. An elk's characteristic is that it is an herbivore and it eats plants, but it also has all of these previous characteristics or these functions to it, as it is the child class of both of these two. To create these characteristics, we create them as functions. So we'll have the class animals, and then in it we will create the function or characteristic breathe, move, and eat food. Going back to the self that we talked about a little earlier on in the video, we use this self when functions call other functions. So when we call functions on an object, we use the object's variable name. So for example, if we have a class mammals, then let's create a class called giraffes. This would be a child class of the class mammals. And then let's create a function called find food. And this will call the other function move in this function, which is the parent class, then print. Then after that, we can call the eat food function from the mammals and have it eat food, which would then print out eating, moving, and then I found food, and then eating food. So to test this, let's create a giraffe. And then we can call so then we get moving, I found food, and then eating food. But now you may ask, what's the point? Well, the main idea is that it's convenient, A, because of reusability and customizability, and B, for organization. Let's say we have two giraffes. We have our giraffe Reginald and we have our giraffe Harold. Because we're using objects and classes, we can tell Python which giraffe we're talking about when we want to run, for example, the function move. If we wanted to make Harold move but leave Reginald in place, we can do that because we're using objects and classes. So, for example, if we wanted to just have Harold move, then we can call Harold.move just for Harold, and only Harold would move. Another reason why we like using classes and objects is because of things like inheritance. So for example, because we're using classes and objects, we don't have to write out the same function for things, inanimate, and animals. We can use inheritance to write it out once for things and then keep passing it on for their child classes inanimate, and in animals, which makes it a lot easier to write code and to keep things organized and to just reuse code in general. Using objects and classes is also very helpful when making large software applications such as word processors or 3D computer games. They're hard to understand because they use large programs because there's so much code, so by using objects and classes, it breaks up the programs into smaller pieces, which makes it more understandable and easier to work on. Breaking up code into objects and classes also lets you collaborate more because you can divide it up among other players by using objects and classes. For example, if we take the example of our animals class, then one person could work on the animals class, another person could work on the mammals class, and the other person could work on giraffes, which makes it a lot easier to work on. Finally, as a summary of what we've learned, today the main focus were objects and classes. We learned about inheritance and parent and child classes and how that can be used. We also learned about the difference between functions and methods and how to use those. And within those, we learned that we need to use self and how to call functions within other functions and things like that. As a couple of extra challenges, try creating a function called dance to teach Harold to dance. So to do this, you would say print out, for example, right foot forward or things like that, and then once you call that dance function, it would print out a list of small dancing steps. And the second challenge is to try to use multiple turtles using the same logic that we learned here to create 3 separate arrows pointing whichever direction you'd like. This also has to do with creating multiple objects with the turtle class. So that was it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this lesson, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!